Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you all for the first part of this three-day symposium on Italian drawings from the 20th century. My name is Edward Kopp. I'm Chief Curator of the Menil Drawing Institute in Houston. The Menil Drawing Institute is a program of the Menil collection, which has its own dedicated building on the Menil campus, which was designed specifically to address the needs and to meet the needs of drawings. And at the core of the Institute's mission is to champion drawing as an autonomous medium and to probe the very nature and the boundaries of the medium during the modern and contemporary period. And we're doing this by fostering scholarship and connoisseurship, and also by raising public awareness and a general understanding of drawing. And while our collecting focus really is on the period ranging from the late 19th century up to today, it is also within our remit to situate drawing in a broad historical context, which we do through exhibitions, research, publications, and programming. This symposium aims to explore aspects of the generative and often overlooked role that drawing played during the 20th century in Italy. This was a remarkably innovative period of artistic production with repercussions on the international stage. And Italian artists pushed the boundaries of what drawing is, investigating its dual nature, theorized in the 16th century with the concept of disegno, as both a physical practice of mark making and as a conceptual process for the generation of ideas. So we will start today with a focus on the early part of the 20th century with a keynote lecture by Professor Emily Braun, and she will focus on the draftsman and sculptor Adolfo Wildt, who, as she will demonstrate, used drawing as a medium of visionary experience. This will be followed by a panel on women artists tomorrow, which will start also at noon Central Time. And on the last day of the symposium, on Friday, we will have a panel on the interconnections between Italian and American artists, also starting at noon Central Time. Please note that the entire event is being recorded and will be made available on the Menil's YouTube channel in a few weeks. For more details, please go and visit the Menil website, www.menil.org. So this symposium is organized in conjunction with the exhibition Silent Revolutions, Italian Drawings from the 20th Century, which is on view at the Menil Drawing Institute until April 11th. And I'm thrilled to be joined on the screen by my co-organizers, Irina Zucca-Alessandrelli and Saskia Verlan. So Irina joins us from Milan. She has been curator of Collezioniamo since 2013, and she's co-curator with me of the present exhibition. Good evening, Irina.
Good evening, Edouard. Good evening from Milan.
Thank you. Great to have you. And I'm also joined by Saskia Verlan, who is the Menil Drawing Institute's inaugural predoctoral fellow and also PhD candidate at the Graduate Center of the City of New York. So, hello, Saskia.
Hello, greetings from Houston.
And so before I introduce today's speaker, we'd like to thank the entire Menil team for making this event possible, and particularly Brian Chappell, Sarah Hobson, Tony Martinez, and Lauren Pollock. I also want to thank the partner institutions that have greatly helped us to promote the event, and namely the Cultural Affairs Office of the Italian Embassy in Washington, D.C., the Italian Consulate in Houston, Collezioniamo, as well as our good colleagues at Magazzino Italian Art. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Emily Braun. It's so great to have you. And Emily Braun is Distinguished Professor at Hunter College and the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. And her scholarship really bridges the academy and the museum. And few, if any, American scholars done more to expand the knowledge of Italian art in the United States than Professor Braun. Extensive writings on Italian modernism and fascist sculpture include a landmark book entitled Mario Cironi and Italian Modernism, Art and Politics Under Fascism, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2000. Also, a edited volume, De Chirico in America, published in 1995, as well as articles on the futurists Giorgio Morandi, Giorgio De Chirico, Lucio Fontana, Arturo Martini, and Magic Realism. In 2015, Braun organized the exhibition Alberto Buri, The Trauma of Painting, for the Solomon Air Guggenheim Museum, which received the annual Daedalus Foundation Exhibition Catalog Award. She's also co-curated 2 exhibitions for the Jewish Museum in New York. One was The Power of Conversation, Jewish Women and Their Salons, 2005, which got the National Jewish Book Award, as well as Gardens and Ghettos, The Art of Jewish Life in Italy in 1989, which was the winner of the Henry Allen Moe Prize. She is an expert on Cubism, has curated the Leonard A. Lauder Cubist collection since 1987, and worked with Mr. Lauder on his transformative gift of the collection to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in a few years ago. And in 2014, with Rebecca Rabinow, who Rebecca was then not yet director of the Menil, she worked with Professor Braun, and they co-organized the Lauder Collection exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum. And that catalog received the Award for Excellence from the American Association of Museum Curators, and also the Henry Allen Moe Prize. Her research has been supported by fellowships from the Getty Foundation and the New York Public Library, the Center for Scholars and Writers. In the spring of 2020, Braun served as the Emon J. Safra Visiting Professor at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, CASVA, at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. So Professor Braun has kindly agreed to take questions after our presentations. Please submit your question via Zoom's Q&A function, which is located at the bottom of your screens. And you can do this at any time throughout the program. And the hope is that she will address as many of your questions as possible towards the end. And should you encounter any technical difficulty, please message us using the chat function. So Professor Braun, we're so thrilled to have you. And now over to you.
Thank you, Edward. And I'm very grateful to you and to Rina Zucca Alessandrelli for inviting me to give this lecture on the occasion of the exhibition Silent Revolutions at the Menil. Bear with me and I will put on my PowerPoint. So, in addition, I also want to thank Saskia Berlan, who was just mentioned by Edward Kopp, and also 2 people who were very much helpful in preparing my presentation in PowerPoint today, Brian Chappelle and Kiki Barnes. Together, Edward, Irina, and Saskia and I agreed that today I would address the drawings of the sculptor Adolfo Wildt, whose monumental charcoal on paper is seen at the center of the installation photograph of the current exhibition. We made this decision, first of all, because the 6 presentations by other experts in the next 2 days focus exclusively on Italian drawings from the post-World War II era. Secondly, because Wildt is virtually unknown in this country. And third, because his understudied corpus of drawings, that is relatively understudied, offers several opportunities for new inquiry. In particular, I was struck by Wildt's unconventional self-portrait, which confronts us with sightlessness, eyes that do not or cannot gaze at us or at the artist himself, as he ostensibly looked up to draw himself. We face an aporia, the inherent contradiction of an artist seeing and rendering mimetically his own sightless visage. Looking deeper and darker, I soon discovered that the theme of blindness, sightlessness, runs through Wildt's drawing and sculpture, including in other self-portraits, as with the example, the carved marble on the left. Though pupilless eyes has been a convention of statuary since antiquity, most Western sculptors, Michelangelo, Bernini, Rodin, regularly delineate attentive and obliging gazes. Instead, eyes gouged, blinded by light, or blinding with divine illumination inform Wildt's signature style. Of course, on the left, he has carved the visage of Santa Lucia, or Saint Lucy, who was martyred and lost her eyes in the process. To be sure, eyes closed signifying interiority and reverie was a common trope of symbolist depictions, but it is underscored as sightlessness and all of its implications in Wildt's work. And blind self-portraits among artists are seemingly anomalous. The conceits of sight and sightlessness, transcendence and sacrifice are drawn out with remarkable binary efficacy in Wildt's drawings in strictly black and white, such as the example on the right, with the occasional touch of gold, a gold that does not so much interrupt the parsimonious visual field, but rather serves to illuminate literally with actual reflective surfaces and metaphorically with the spiritual light of the visionary, as in the stars seen on the parchment page that fill up half the parchment page in the example, Spirit of the Night. Obviously, Wildt did not puncture the paper support the way he broke through the marble sheath in his sculpture. He would leave that to his pupil Lucio Fontana. But in most of his drawings, he used knife-sharp line to delineate closed, vacated, and pupilless eyes. And I believe actually that this work, the Mendiant, is also a self-portrait. In homage to Wildt's graphic style, I have precisely outlined my talk in 3 sections today. First, an introduction to the artist that draws out the salient contours of his career in his sculptures, which bear a direct relationship with his draftsmanship. Second, a detailed look at his corpus of finished autonomous drawings, which fall roughly into 2 groups, both of which are represented in the Rameau collection. His crepuscular charcoal compositions, such as God Gave Life to Man from 1925 on the left, and the second series from 1912 to 1929, his main series of autonomous finished drawings, which are made with pen and ink on paper, or parchment. So there are some on paper, the main are in parchment. And the gold in the work apparently is gold powder diluted with glue and water. Wildt also reproduced many of his line drawings as etchings with aquatint, as the example here. In the third and last section of my talk, I will throw some shade onto Jacques Derrida's 1993 text, Memoirs of the Blind, the Self-Portrait, and Other Ruins. Born in 1868 in Milan to a family of very modest economic means, his father worked as the portinaio, or the concierge at City Hall. Wildt was one of 6 children. Despite ending elementary school at 3rd grade, he eventually became the chair of sculpture at the Brera Academy in Milan. For 20 years, he enjoyed the patronage of the Prussian collector Franz Rose until the latter's death in 1912. Through Rose, Wildt was immersed in the art of Central European secession style and Jugendstil, and he likely also met Georg Simmel, who had authored texts on Michelangelo and Rodin, the latter whom Wildt considered both idol and antipode. Important to know, too, is that one of Wildt's 3 children, Artemia, married Giovanni Schaewiller, who became one of the most important European art book publishers of the interwar period, a business that continued after the Second World War with Wildt's grandson, Vanni Schaewiller. Wildt's son-in-law had a vast photographic collection, an archive of European art, a museum without walls. Aside from Rose's early patronage, the other more profound influence on Wildt's art was a 3-year period of clinical manic depression from 1906 to 1909, which indelibly marked the morbidity of his art and its tormented self-regard. He recalled, and I quote, "A void was everywhere around me. In my studio, wherever I put my hands, things turned to ruin," unquote. The contemporary artist, Anselmo Bucci, described Wildt as a mystic who is tormented and torments others. In his drawings and paintings, he self-represents as the man of sorrows and self-identified as a Christ figure who is sacrificed to his art. In the ink on parchment drawing, Amen, I'm showing it here, with the black curtain of night about to come down, the artist holds his chisel and a carving hammer, which resembles the cross he has had to bear. The emphatic linearism of these drawings would have been redolent to the contemporary viewers of Gothic art, especially the Man of Sorrows, and Trecento and Quattrocento primitives. Needless to say, Wildt excelled at tomb sculpture and funerary monuments. Many of his drawn figures have the rigid bearing of the entombed. And I was reminded of Gabriele D'Annunzio's almost contemporary prose poem, Notturno, or Nocturne, written in 1916 on slips of paper when D'Annunzio was temporarily blinded after an aviation accident and confined to bed. The text was published in 1921. Full of references to art, I just choose one where D'Annunzio writes, blindfolded, I lie supine in bed, my torso immobile. My pose feels in every way as stiff as that of an Egyptian scribe carved in basalt. D'Annunzio and Wildt knew each other, and D'Annunzio owned some of Wildt's work. Luigi Pirandello was another collector and admirer of the sculptor draftsman. Now, Wildt's preferred medium was marble. He was renowned for his technical skill and his style that defied mass and substance. He hollowed out, winnowed, and polished the marble to create smooth and diaphanous surfaces, thin membranes, which reveal muscle and sinew beneath. Despite the obvious homages to Michelangelo in Wildt's early work, his style was at furthest removed from the idea of the non finito. His paradoxical dematerialization of material led many of his contemporaries to consider him a Baroque revivalist, a perception which was enhanced by the black and white images produced in collaboration with the Milanese photographer Emilio Samoriva. And this has been the subject of a very interesting study by Laura Mare Cecchini. In 1915, Wildt increasingly refined his technique to include luminous low bas-relief, deliberately akin to the schiacciato, or barely perceptible minuscule carving of the early 15th century Florentine sculptors Nino da Fiesole and Desiderio da Settignano. Anselmo Bucci compared Wildt's carving to snow modeled by the wind. Planar surfaces and crisply delineated contours determine Wildt's sculpture's aggressive frontality, which we see too in the drawings. Precision carving inscribes the deep caverns of ears, eyes, and mouths, resulting in closed contoured silhouetted voids. Wildt also often engraved gilded text into the stone, letters that underscore the relationship between abstract and signifying line. In preparing this lecture, it occurred to me that it is as if Adolfo Wildt draws with sculpture, or better yet, sculpts with line. Wildt's paradoxical treatment of solid material left its mark on two of his students at the Brera Academy, Lucio Fontana and Fausto Melotti. On the right is an early work by Fontana indebted to Wildt, though, as Melotti recounted, Fontana had fits of frustration in attempting to emulate Wildt's skill in dissembling the obstinacy of sculpture with the look of ease and ethereality, which is why perhaps Fontana soon abandoned conventional carving and assaulted matter with modeling excavations and punctures, Wildt's gouged eyes. For his part, in the 1970s, Melotti lauded Wildt's drawings for their, quote, delicate and gentle lyricism, unquote, as if he were speaking of his own finely wrought abstract sculptures of thin gold planes and filaments. Wildt is considered the most important early 20th century Italian sculptor after Medardo Rosso, his elder by 10 years, and their work could not be more different. Rosso roughly modeled his soft sculptural masses in response to the dematerializing effects of external light and atmosphere and optical veracity linked to Impressionism. Wildt's carved marbles are impervious to the accidental and contingent optical experience, as are his drawings. Likewise, Rosso drew barely discernible sketch-like impressions of the street, whereas Wildt's exacting line extracts and petrifies images of clairvoyance and piety from the mutable flow of time. Wildt was very much, and still is, an odd man out. His art is difficult to categorize, even if it fits generally into the symbolist milieu. His career spanned the fin de siècle and the first decade of the fascist period, and his drawings, in particular, were profoundly affected by World War I. Wildt was deeply religious, invested in the Christian faith, in an age where spiritual secularism marked the evolution of modernist abstraction. He was an odd man out, especially in the last decade of his career. He died in 1931, because it corresponded to the first decade of fascism. His stylistic amalgam of the late Gothic, Expressionist, Baroque, and the overtly morbid, chafed against the classicism, modernist or academic, favored during the fascist period. Moreover, he was constantly assumed to be German because of his Germanic surname, his German network of collectors, and the Jugendstil influences on his art, despite his wholly Italian origins. Indeed, the fascist cultural czarina Margherita Sarfatti advised Wildt to change his name and make it more Italian sounding, a suggestion which offended him and which he flatly refused to do. So let us address the elephant in the gallery before proceeding. Wildt did sculpt the iconic image of Mussolini in marble and bronze. The marble, along with that of Maestro Arturo Toscanini, was exhibited in the Biennale di Venezia in 1924. Just a curious note, Toscanini did run on the fascist parliamentary ticket in 1919, but soon became an outspoken anti-fascist. In other words, Wildt could do virile when called upon. Evidence to date, however, shows that Wildt was no apologist for the dictatorship. Some have underscored the fact that at the 1931 Quadriennale, Mussolini refused to enter into the room which contained Wildt's art, including the original drawings for the great days of God and humanity, which we'll be looking at today, and which we saw the example from the Ramo collection. The sculptor died 2 days later. He did not live to see the worst of the regime. In sum, Wildt's inferred Germanic qualities, his decadent style, and his morbid and devout Christian imagery did not conform to the fascist emphasis on Italianità. Let's look at the drawings now in some detail. The image, God Gave Life to Man, in the Ramo collection is part of a series of 12 monumental charcoal drawings, each measuring 3 by 4 feet. The series is entitled The Great Days of God and Humanity, and they depict, these 12 images depict the creation cycle and the 4 eras of humankind. In scale and technique, they were conceived to be reproduced photographically for the album you see on the right, which Wildt did for charity. All the proceeds went to war orphans and children in poverty. The drawings, like the self-portrait, which I opened the lecture with today, are exceptions in his graphic oeuvre for their soft, crepuscular chiaroscuro rendered in charcoal. The preeminent Wildt scholar, Paola Mola, has written extensively on the artist's transhistorical synthesis of sources in his sculpture and drawings, from Greek vase painting to the Hellenistic dying Gaul and Michelangelo, from the Quattrocento Italian primitives to Central European Jugendstil. Today, I want to add some potential new sources, perhaps some speculative, for his culturally voracious drawing style. Even if I cannot prove direct influence, it is revealing to look at these affinities among artists who use the graphic medium to represent visions and visionary experience, in a way cutting through nationalistic frameworks. They depict bodies in ecstasy, suffering, and trance-like states. Or in this case, in the case of the specific series by Wildt, the creative and form-giving light of the divine. Now the swelling muscular figures and the severe face of God, the rather angry and revengeful father, as well as the serene symmetry of other faces in Wildt's cycle here, obviously pay homage to Michelangelo. But I would like to suggest that there is another artist in between, one who channeled Michelangelo, but to anti-naturalistic ends, the draftsman and engraver William Blake. Note how Wildt's compositions in this series seem to play off the iconic image of Blake's Ancient of Days, where the godlike, not entirely positive godlike figure of Urizen uses a compass to divide solid from void. It's almost as if Wildt picked up on this motif of the dividing compass and used it in these diagonals and triangular forms and vectors that splay and divide the surface of these compositions. The sweeping, omnipotent face and hair of the God figure, too, is also redolent of Blake, as are lines of radiating light in starry firmaments. As are, too, the brooding, if luminous skies, the churning clouds and heavenly fires that envelop the graphic field. As the British art historian and librarian William Kinnerton Parkes, known for his 1922 two-volume publication, Sculpture of Today, wrote, Wildt's drawings represent visions of seeing that take on a monumental character, which is not surprising, so much as symptomatic of the inner sight of the seer, words that likewise apply to William Blake. And of course, Blake was a draftsman engraver like Wildt. The question of Blake leads us to his circle, Henry Fuseli and John Flaxman, both of whom spent much time in Italy in the late 19th century, and Italian master printers engraved their works. Fuseli and Flaxman's work were widely disseminated. And in the case of Fuseli, particularly the engravings after his work for Johann Caspar Lavater's influential Essays on Physiognomy. One sees here the facial expressions of torment and despair echoed in Wildt, also inspired by the Christian subject matter of the damned in Dante's Inferno. And this is something I could not look into today, but I think there is a study to be done in general on allusions to Dante and the experience of both the damned and the saved that Wildt alludes to in his drawings. As Wildt stated, quote, I have the right to contort the traditional style of an element or limb if this gives a sharper and more acute coefficient of expression. If there is a muscle that governs certain facial movements, a muscle that enters into play when one smiles or suffers, so I will abnormally accentuate this muscle when I want to express joy or suffering. That is likewise above the normal. I was intrigued to see the Lavater Fuseli face on the right with eyelash tears, which may well be the source of a sculptural representation unique to Wildt and used often, eyes sunk deep into orbital cavities with the finely carved lashes of tears. Between 1913 and 1912 and 1921, Wildt's larger series of pen and ink on parchment are his largest and most significant body of independent drawings. Choice motifs are sparely touched by gold paint, objects made of reflective materials such as shields and trumpets, or more typically halos, sacred blossoms and fruit, heavenly stars, and more rarely bodies sanctified by God's golden grace. In Wildt's draftsmanship, you will not find one stray stroke, let alone passages of shading on the surface to suggest the contingencies of light and atmosphere. The linear economy of this style is also a moral one. The severity of Wildt's hard-edged outline stands in deliberate contrast to what John Ruskin termed the licentiousness of the sketch. Contemporaries noted the sharpness of the line and the analogies to the engraver's blade. The denial of color and of sensual liquidity of watercolor wash, for example, equals sanctity of spirit. Wildt's compositions rely on these uncompromising negative and positive spaces and the binaries of light and dark, whose metaphors delineate the clearest of metaphors. The outer form is but the representation of the inner life, or l'anima e le sue veste, the soul and its sheath. Wildt's visionary line stands for the pure idea, and in most cases of his subject matter, Christian purity incarnate. As the contemporary critic Ettore Cozzani wrote of Wildt's apparitional images, quote, "The soul and spirit surpasses the form. The body vanishes in the splendor of the interior light," unquote. As I noted, Wildt's spectral figures are at farthest removed rather from material reality because they negate the illusion of three-dimensionality wrought by chiaroscuro modeling. The minimum of applied medium produces the maximum expressive effect. Through the rhythm and repetition of line, Wildt animates his lifeless figures with the resolute flow of ink, the continuous thin thread, as we follow blindly the loops and the bends, the darts and the curves, the under and over, the straightening and the undulating. So sure is his handling of line that it imparts a sensation of the artist as medium, an apparition or inner vision directly recorded upon the blank sheet. To quote that other visionary draftsman, William Blake, "The more distinct, sharp, and wiry the bounding line, the more perfect the work of art. If you leave out line, you leave out life itself." For Ruskin, in part inspired by Gothic tracery, the linear characterized, quote, "the feverish energy of imagination," unquote. Now, the linearism and illuminated touches of Wildt's designs have rightly been compared to the graphic designs of the Vienna Secession and its journal Vers Sacrum. One can point to Klimt's Beethoven frieze, housed in the Secession building, especially in the use of gold. One also sees references, as in the image here on the left, direct quotation really, of the golden boughs that form the roof of Joseph Albrecht's Secession building. Aside from Klimt's published graphic design or this mural, however, Wildt's drawing style bears little resemblance to Klimt's prolific pen and ink and graphite pencil corpus. The differences are pronounced. Missing from Wildt's sheets is the pan-European Art Nouveau trope of enveloping waves and female tresses, the excess of serpentine line. Note how most of his women have their hair capped. There are none of these flowing tresses. Likewise, Jugendstil and Art Nouveau graphics display a horror vacui, that is, they fill up most of the page, whereas Wildt leaves large areas of the white parchment in reserve, untouched, to create a spareness that underscores the theme of agape, or spiritual love, not erotic overtones. Indeed, I think a closer comparison might be made to the drawings which were disseminated widely as engravings by John Flaxman, which again would have additional appeal because one whole group of well-known engravings were illustrations, again, for Dante's Divine Comedy. I hate to say it, but another close comparison could be made to a figure who, like Wildt, was both draftsman and sculptor, namely the British carver Eric Gill. Here, perhaps more a question of commonality of style than of influence. But Gill's piety, as we know, was undercut by the unsavory and notorious details of his biography, including his incestuous relationships with his daughters and his penchant for canine affairs. Instead, I would like to mention perhaps what would be a profound and more plausible inspiration for Wildt's linear drawings, one that makes sense thematically and religiously in its spare outline style, in medium and specific motifs. Perhaps they involve an homage to Sandro Botticelli's illustrations for Dante's Divine Comedy. Rendered in the late 15th century, the surviving cycle of Botticelli's drawings comprises 92 sheets. They were discovered to much fanfare when Friedrich Lippmann acquired them for the Berlin museums in 1882 from a private British collection, sweeping them up just before they were about to be sold publicly at auction by Sotheby's. They were then published in deluxe facsimile editions in German in 1887 and in English in 1896. And I'm showing you the cover of the English facsimile edition on the left. One can easily see the appeal for Wildt. Indeed, his choice of sheep parchment as a support may be considered eccentric, but it was the same support used by Botticelli for his Dante drawings. One notes a similar expanse of white ground, the exclusive predilection for outline. And I'm showing you the image, the drawing on the right by Botticelli with the spindly trees with tiny budding fruit and delicate symmetrical leaves, which we find in Wildt's ink drawings. I draw your attention too, in particular, to the elliptical circles delineated by Wildt in many of these drawings, such as L'Ombra and Amen, and this work on the upper right, which we're going to look at again in a moment. In addition to picking up on this ellipsis, which we find notably in the Paradiso set of Botticelli drawings, Wildt also seemed to emulate the three-pointed flame, which is used repeatedly by Botticelli, both in the Inferno cycle and also in Paradiso. Botticelli's piety, of course, was well known. He was a devout follower of the religious fanatic Savonarola. Certainly Dante and Botticelli were the artistic and moral epitomes for Ruskin, Walter Pater, the Pre-Raphaelites, and Catholic symbolists of the fin de siècle. And as I mentioned, these drawings came to the fore in the later 19th century and drew much international attention in art historical and connoisseur circles. There is one curious drawing that is frequently reproduced in books and catalogs on Wildt, but seemingly not discussed. From 1916, it is titled by the inscription on the parchment, Tre scultori moderni, three modern sculptors, Rodin, Meunier, and Giametto. I believe that this drawing, and I'm showing you the same drawing seen obviously in a different type of photograph, I think this drawing must have been for or in response to an article of the same name published by Vittorio Pica, a renowned critic, particularly of symbolist art, for the fin de siècle art journal Emporium. Pica and Wildt became close friends around this time. The drawings in Pica's article, however, reveal how different Wildt's were from the naturalistic Giametto and Meunier with their chiaroscuro modeling, and from Rodin, both his symbolist works and his ineffable nudes with their sensuous color washes. I actually interpret this drawing as being Wildt's personal and sarcastic retort to the three, perhaps expressing his wrath or annoyance at being excluded from Pica's article. Note how the three male figures are drawn and bound by Wildt's line. And now that we are a little familiar with Wildt's drawings, we see that each bears a distinctive Wildt attribute. Rodin, who apparently never responded to a solicitous letter written by the young Wildt, grimaces in fright or disgust at a ghoulishly smiling Wildt-like mask. Wildt's distinctive three-pronged flame burns at the chest of Meunier, who nonetheless clutches it close, and Giametto leans on our artist's flowering bough for support, like a crutch. More satire than homage, no wonder this drawing was not used by Pica, if in fact he had commissioned it. Wildt composes with precisely delineated dark or light closed contoured planes, silhouettes. How exactly did the artist manage to infill these areas of black ink so resolutely and evenly without any different impression, without any mishap that might have created an interior tonal modulation? Thinking about this, I wonder if he used a template with the cutout shapes and placed it over the sheet so that any errant bleed of the ink would not disperse on the actual ground of this white support. We need a future technical examination by conservators to answer these questions. Of course, using a template, one could draw such an image blind. Now, the lack of penumbra or gradation from light and dark, as we have seen, results in a lack of plasticity, in an absolute flatness. As a sculptor and a draftsman, it perhaps makes sense that Wildt largely restricts his drawing idiom to outline and silhouettes. But in doing so, he may well have been making a deliberate allusion to the origin story of Western representation, that of the Corinthian maiden, daughter of the potter Dubutades. For here, drawing and sculpture are born before painting. As her lover was departing for war, the maiden drew his outline projected by lamplight on the wall. Both index and icon, the traced image was a direct imprint of his individual physiognomy, a sign of absence and presence. The story, as recounted by Pliny the Elder, however, does not end there, for Dubutades then took the silhouetted form and modeled it in clay, fired it in his kiln, the origins of sculpture, namely in bas-relief. Wildt's drawing based on silhouettes and oftentimes representing shades can be linked directly to the origins of drawing, or skiography, shadow drawing. Which brings me back to the subject of blindness. In his 1990 essay for a show and catalogue at the Louvre, Derrida wrote on the relationship between drawing, self-portraiture, and blindness. An essay which deliberately puts the reader in the position of groping through the textual thicket. With examples mainly of drawings by painters, he argues that in the act of putting pen to paper, the originary line itself becomes invisible, for it gives itself over to the representation of a figure or object. Second, that the artist himself, and the artist is a him in Derrida's text, that the artist must momentarily turn his eye away from the object of mimesis and blindly recall it from memory when eyeing a sheet. In other words, he has to turn away from what he's looking at to look down upon the paper, momentarily being blind from the object that he is rendering. Thirdly, and in particular, when looking in the mirror to render the self-image, the artist must fixate upon the vehicle of that seeing, the eye, and that focused sight eclipses the sight of anything else. Using the series of drawn portraits by Fontana, Derrida elaborates the blind operation of self-portraiture, arguing that the spectator ultimately takes the viewing position of the artist. And as we now gaze back at his gaze and meet it, we, no longer the mirror, that this is a form of vision robbing, of gouging out the artist, of gouging out the eyes of the artist, to use his words, and replacing them with our own. Much of Derrida's essay also addresses the drawing of the actually blind, of persons with lidded eyes or ones raised upwards, as if to see the light. And he chooses, for example, this work by Koppel, so that all the pupils, and in these renditions of the blind that look upwards, so that the pupil rolls back on the diagonal, and all you see are white slits, essentially. He also gives other example of eyes blinded by tears. To explain the spectacle of blindness, Derrida falls back upon the age-old convention in art, as he puts it, of representing the unrepresentable, that is, superior inner vision. He refers to this as the spectacle of the sacrifice, quote, the sacrifice in which blindness is exchanged for another form of sight, and sacrifice involves some sort of violence, punishment, conversion, martyrdom, eyes wounded, or bedazzled, unquote. Blind faith, in other words, produces blindness. Derrida asks the rhetorical question, have we ever seen a blind draftsman? By the way, he does not mention the actual drawing instruction technique known as blind contour drawing. That's just an aside. Most significantly, he does not show or discuss any example of an artist self-depicting as blind in any medium. Pity that he did not know the work of Wildt, as it might have dialogically driven his discourse on drawing and blindness and the self-portrait as ruin. As the futurist poet Paolo Buzzi wrote of Wildt's haunting lack of reciprocal vision, what we have here are eyes, 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 eyes like wells dug deep into shadow and light. Wildt's eyes are gouged out or exaggerated or show exaggerated orbital cavities, or they're infilled with gold, or left open in some cases like masks, but a mask that dissembles, for it cannot be filled by another face. Sorry, cannot be filled by another face. It is already occupied by an individual soul. That Wildt was a sculptor, however, adds yet another dimension, not to do with castration or ruin, but the venerable paragone of painting versus sculpture, of a two-dimensional art versus a three-dimensional one. Derrida illustrates this drawing in his text, but he does not discuss it in the body of his essay. Painting, it might be said, has the upper hand because it has the assets of color and chiaroscuro. But a painter who fully loses sight is lost, whereas a sculptor can still feel his or her around, modeling, feeling, and matching mass, distance, and scale. Likewise, as this drawing shows, the actually blind can still experience and appreciate art when that art is modeled or carved and not painted. Does the blind sculptor not have, therefore, a creative power superior to the blind painter? Derrida's term, the spectacle of sacrifice in viewing those without sight, is very useful, however, in looking at Wildt's blind self-representations in drawing. For in drawing himself sightless, he draws himself as Christ-like, a tradition begun famously by Albrecht Dürer in his self-portraits. Of course, you can see, as Joseph Koerner has written extensively in the drawing on the right, Dürer scrutinizing his sight. The focus is on the eye, looking at the self. All the more extraordinary, then, Wildt's heresy to pose as the dead and crucified Christ, eyes closed or rolled back. Blindness, natural in exchange for artistic genius. One can never forget the eyes of Adolfo Wildt, observed the writer Ada Negri. They are always feverish, eyes that one can never imagine closed in sleep, much less in death, unquote. And I just wanted to point out that in some publications, this drawing is just titled Self-Portrait, and in others, it's entitled Self-Portrait on the Cross, which it clearly is on the cross, but Wildt leaves that ambiguous because the top of the head obscures the top of the cross. We can theorize the relationship of blindness to drawing, and we can interpret, based on exact visual evidence, the representation of blindness in art, be it in sculpture, painting, or drawing. I end today, however, with a professional note on working in the dark, on the inability to see. I prepared this talk today blind. I have never seen any of his drawings by Wildt that I discussed today. I have never laid eyes on them. Because of the COVID pandemic, I was unable to travel to Houston or to Milan to see their textures, the actual pressures of the pen, the smudging, velvety depths of the black charcoal, the reflections off the gold ink, the dry, buckling parchment. At one point, Edouard Kopp became my eyes and sent me high-res close-ups of details of the drawings. But even so, the backlit digital prosthetic of the video screen is no substitute. Any insights I may have offered today are subject to future verification, to presence, not absence. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very rich and very inspiring talk, which made a really very convincing and powerful connection with other artists. I think of Botticelli and Blake and Flaxman, for example, and you've really opened our eyes, not just opened them, but in the first place, given us eyes to see his drawings in such a fascinating way. And what we thought we would do is we would start off the Q&A session by asking you some questions, and then we'll open up to the floor. And I know, having looked at some of Paola Mola's work, that he's known from an early age to have preferred to study black and white reproductions of works in books or on postcards, as opposed to looking at the originals themselves on the basis, as he apparently put it, that the contrasts were stronger. And so it might suggest that he was after linear structure as opposed to establishing a sensual relationship with his models. And I was wondering whether you might speak to that and how it might fit with his synthetic approach to drawing, which is really based on line and based, as you so eloquently said, on these strong polarities between light and dark.
Yes, he had, I think the drawings themselves show a more synthetic or syncretic approach to a variety of sources, which the photographic archive of Chez Wheeler would have provided him with. I think for the sculptures, what you're discussing, the photographs of artworks would have been actually more valuable than the drawings. But certainly the precision of the juxtaposition of light and dark in photography, I'm not sure how influential it would have been on drawings. I think as source material, yes. I think more influential on the sculpture, which he then exploited in that extraordinary series of photographs done by Emilia Samariva. Within that corpus of photographic reproductions, he would have seen many examples of engraving and drawing, which is why I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that he would have been able to see examples of the British sculptors, engravers, artists who have actually, to my knowledge, not been brought. I'm not a Wildt expert. The talk today was the first time I have actually studied or written or presented on the artist. But there are reasons to believe that he could have seen them through photographs, and then also in the actual engravings and published books by Flaxman and Fuseli and the like.
I would like to thank Professor Braun for a fascinating talk. As a co-curator of the exhibition Silent Revolution with Edouard Kopp and as curator of Collezione Ramo, I'm very, very, very honored that our works are at the center of this important symposium that sheds light on Italian drawing of the previous century. With regard to the figure of Wildt, I think it's interesting to note that for a long time, it was a marginalized artist in Italy, being almost forgotten about and remain little known. In 1968, the art critic Guido Baldo generated renewed interest in Wildt's career with an exhibition of his drawings at Milan Academy of Fine Arts, where Wildt had taught sculpture, and more recently, Paola Mola has organized exhibitions concerning the artist. So when Edouard and I chose to include two of the Wildt drawings in the exhibition, I hope that by presenting his work today in the United States, we would finally do him the justice he deserves. My feeling is that almost 100 years after his death, Wildt died in 1931, his work might finally be able to find an audience that really appreciates its incredible modernity. I'm thinking here of the image of God breathing life into a human figure, which does not look like a drawing that was made a century ago. I think that his contemporary associated Wildt too much with his sculpted portraits, such as the one he made of Mussolini, and so failed to see the real value of his work. I would like to know Professor Braun's point of view regarding the discovery or rediscovery of this artist today. What do you think constitutes Wildt modernity?
Thank you, Irina. I want to answer that question after I respond to something else you said about the obstacles to appreciating his work. And I think perhaps there are two main obstacles. One is that we just don't see it. We've never really seen it over here in a full-fledged exhibition or museums. The other is the profound Christianity of the subject matter, which is, I think, so alien to modernism on the whole. There are obviously exceptions to that, and the Christian content might be a little heavy or off-putting to some, And that may be one reason why, even though, of course, there's strains of sarcasm and even heresy in some of those representations, as I tried to show today in his self-portraits. And as to the issue of modernity, I see Wildt as very much a bridge figure, that figure of a fin de siècle sculptor. And I think his modernity resides there, which is not a negative or a detriment. Even in the revival of figurative art and sculpture, he seems to be unique and stand alone. And we certainly know how the fin de siècle symbolist period is the bridge. It is essential to the development of later modernist abstraction. But he didn't go there. He's not an abstract artist at all. So I would place him in that first phase of modernism, that is symbolism. I don't like categories like this. I think it inhibits our appreciation of the work.
Thank you.
And what's amazing with him is, in a way, in terms of his sources, it's all over the place. I mean, he does create a synthesis that is very much his own, but it's dizzying at first when you go through his work to try and make sense, and certainly any attempt to, categorize or pigeonhole him is bound to fail.
Yes, I just bound to fail, speaking of Bruce Miller. But I do think we could say that actually, now that I think about it, one aspect of the modernity is the performative self in those self-portraits. We could compare it to an Egon Schiele, for example. And in that sense, he breaks with traditional self-portraiture in a way that's very modern. Understood as later 20th century modern.
Thank you, Professor Braun. This has been such a fascinating talk. And while you were presenting on this and discussing the idea of blindness in his work, it made me think that it is so rare to have artists who self-represent as blind, but several decades later, we have a number of artists who are experimenting with methods of drawing blind, like William Anastasi, Cy Twombly, and Robert Morris. And there's always this emphasis on kind of the touch, the haptic experience of drawing. And you mentioned briefly the advantage of a blind sculptor versus a blind painter, and I wondered if you just had any further comments on this kind of connection between drawing and touch, and how that plays out in Wildt's work.
Yes, I'd be interested to know, Saskia, if some of those artists are doing that after the publication of Derrida's text. I don't know when Robert Morris's drawings are that. So certainly some of that experimentation actually has to do also with process and feel of the materials, and also the idea of series and no obligation to actually render anything mimetically. I mentioned there is this actual drawing technique, it's called blind contour drawing. And what I didn't show today were drawings by Wildt, which were either done before or after certain sculptures where you see that they're just pure outline contours of the faces of his sculpture, which is kind of fascinating and is worth delving into. But I obviously used the Derrida text and blindness to sort of dialogically work with Wildt's self-representation, and in a way to undercut some of those arguments, which have been undercut in plenty of other places. But it was just fascinating to look at an actual draftsman who self-represents himself blind, but is clearly not blindfolded when he's doing those drawings. Nothing is left for chance, and nothing is being, I made reference to him as a medium, but I'm not in the same sense of an exquisite corpse by a surrealist artist or surrealist automatic drawing, for which you would not need sight because you just let the pen or the pencil doodle and sprawl across the page. Obviously, Wildt is putting great thought into drawing in the viewer in an anti-naturalistic way to have the sense of a vision being experienced by the artist himself.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think some of those drawings predate I know at least some like Cy Twombly predate the publication of the Derrida text, but I think it's a really interesting way to kind of reframe this concept of blindness. So thank you. I want to now look into some of the public questions, if that's all right. So I think we'll start with, if you could comment on the motif of the tilted or dropped head, not only in Wildt's self-portraits, but throughout most of his figures. The commenter notes that the heads are almost never erect.
Yes, I think that they are, it's a sign also of death, of a body that has expired, which of course would render that body blind. I mean, the face blind, because one's no longer seeing. So the two concepts are connected. But in both, in the images of the drawings that I showed, where he is either just deposed off the cross or still leaning on it, obviously his head is hanging for that reason.
Mm-hmm. And all right,
but for that reason, he couldn't be, excuse me, but for that same reason, he couldn't be looking at himself in the mirror very easily. Of course, by this point, we have photography for artists to use, so they no longer need to look in the mirror, obviously.
Was it known if he was using photography in his practice at all?
I do not know. That's a question for an expert such as Paola Mola. As I mentioned, he's certainly using photography to record and promote the effects of looking, the Baroque and surface effects of his work. I don't think you need photography for the line drawings.
Another question from the audience. Is Wildt engaged at all with the metaphysical discussions about sightless sight or inner vision as exemplified in de Chirico's self-portrait of 1911?
Could you repeat the question?
Yes. Is Wildt engaged at all with metaphysical discussions about sightless sight or inner vision?
Yes.
And the comment, yeah.
Yes,
they reference.
Yes, very much so. And this is obviously something that runs throughout the history of Western art. Either in a Christian sense of revelation in a Christian sense, and then also later on as a sign of interior creative light. Absolutely. De Chirico, of course, put sunglasses on some of his sculptures as to extend that idea of blindness, and that's also related to the blind portrait, the blind poet Orpheus. So. We can find many constellations of insight and seer.
Another question that sort of situates Wildt among his contemporaries. What would you think about a possibly interesting parallel comparison with the graphics of Arturo Martini dating to 1913 to 1914, not only in terms of style, but also in relation to blindness? Thinking about Fanciulla piena di amore and relative graphics, for example, if you're aware of those pieces.
We're talking here Arturo Martini and not Alberto, who was another prominent draftsman of the time, who did the first, the cover of Poesia, where the first Futurist Manifesto was published in Italy. Arturo Martini, by the way, really didn't like Wildt's work, called him a degenerate. Really very negative on his decadent style. And yes, again, we would find examples throughout those early works of Arturo Martini are symbolist influence. And in the case of young girls with their eyes closed, it's also a sign of a virginal innocence. So we can find many examples of contemporaries with eyes closed. I cannot find another contemporary draftsman or sculptor whose corpus includes this connection between, once you see closed eyes and the deep orbital cavities in Wildt's work, hollowed out eyes of voids, they all connect in this idea of sightlessness, and in some cases overt and of course metaphoric blindness. Saskia, I have a question that's popped up on my screen. May I answer it?
Yes,
from Lucia Ray, who will be speaking in the symposium, who asked me to comment more on the use of the death mask in Wildt. Now, many writers on Wildt have mentioned the mask, and obviously the fact that the eyes are hollowed out in the sculpture, perhaps one's first association is of a mask, because you put a mask on and the eyes of the wearer come through, but the wearer is still disguised. I actually, with the exception of a specific masks that have no back, because there are sculptures, as I showed you, the reverse of the soul and its sheath, the eyes are cut out like a mask, but it is not something that could be slipped over the face. So I actually find most of his works not to be mask-like, some yes, and I'm not aware if he actually did any plaster masks of a live or a dead person. I'm not aware of the use of that. But certainly a viewer could see in the precise physiognomies of some of the finely patinaed and polished mask-like faces, the idea that it could fit perfectly over a dead individual's face.
Right. Well,
it's a little too stylized, also. You know, if you look at the death mask of William Blake or Cesare Lombroso, the features are much more individualized.
Well, I think
we may reach the end of our time together, so perhaps there's time for one last question.
Perfect. I think so. We have a question that I think might be a good way to wrap up about the viewer and the experience of these works, which poses, since any work of art cannot see, does this emphasis on Wildt trouble the concept of the capacity of viewers to engage, to see a work or to see oneself through it, and to perhaps question the status of self?
That's a fascinating question. I just picked up on some of the words. To see through, I think in many of Wildt's sculptures, you actually can see through it because the eyes are vacant orbs. So you have an experience of those sculptures which are very different, say, than the works I showed you at the beginning, by classical statuary or Michelangelo, Rodin, or Bernini. And yes, he problematizes this reciprocal gaze, because on the one hand, when you see these dark voids, you do think that you're being looked back at, and then you realize you can't be being looked back at because there are no eyes there. So it is a fascinating, experience to be in front of one of those works, and unnerving.
Professor Braun, thank you so much. It was really a gift to everyone, and thank you so much. A very thought-provoking talk. And so I also want to thank our audience, and I'd like to remind everyone that you are more than welcome to join us tomorrow for the panel on draftswomen, and starting at 12 noon Central Time. So thank you so much, and see you soon.